main part of this service. Good morning and happy Sabbath again. I welcome those that are physically with us, those that will be watching online, us as well. Today we're continuing in our discussion on the book of Daniel. Last time we started looking at King Nebuchadnezzar, who wanted to know the future. He was concerned with what's going to happen after him. But do you remember where we began with our study? We went all the way back to the beginning. God called Abraham out of the land of Ur, and he called him to be a pilgrim and a stranger. But yet he gave him a promise that out of his heir will become a great nation. And that great nation, as we know later on, became the people of Israel. Throughout the history of people of Israel, God was the one that was guiding them and protecting them. Though at times they were disobedient, in the beginning they followed God through his prophets and through the visions that were given to the prophets. As the time progressed and they were enslaved in Egypt, God took them out of Egypt. He brought them across the wilderness. Through the disobedience, a lot of them perished because, again, they did not trust in God. Do you remember the statement that I brought last time? Why was God so interested in people of Israel? He wanted them to become a beacon of light to the other nations of what God can do through his people if they obey him. So that was the plan for people of Israel. That's what God had in mind. But do you remember, as they settled in the land, in the promised land, what did they ask for? Give us a king so that we can be like what? Like other nations. They did not like God ruling anymore. They wanted someone else to rule instead. God obliged, and through Samuel, we find out that the first king was anointed, and his name was Saul. The first three kings, they ruled a united kingdom. After the third king, who was Solomon, when his son came to power, unfortunately, he listened to the advice of the younger counselors rather than the older counselors, and the kingdom was split into two. There was a southern kingdom and there was a northern kingdom. And throughout those kingdoms, there were a lot of strife, there were a lot of persecution. Every year, every few years or so, they would lapse, they would become idol worshippers. God would send another nation to punish them. They would come to realization why they're being punished. They would repent and God would bless them, and the cycle continued for a time. And then we find that there was a kingdom that emerged through all of this. And what was that kingdom? Do you remember? I'm sorry? Babylon, correct. It was Persia first, but then they sort of dwindled down, and Babylon emerged from that kingdom. Babylon conquered, and Babylon became one of the greatest empires that actually ruled the world. When we looked at the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, he had in his vision a great statue. And the statue was made of gold, silver, brass, iron. And what were the 10 toes made of? Iron and what? And clay. There were the 10 kingdoms that we looked at them as well. The kingdoms that we know, or the countries that we know rather that exist today. So Nebuchadnezzar wanted to know what's going to happen in the future. God gave him a vision or a dream, and then he took it away. And through Daniel, God was able to show Nebuchadnezzar what is going to happen in the future. Now today we will look at what parallels Daniel chapter 2 and particularly Daniel chapter 7. We find in Daniel chapter 7 verses 1 through 3 that Daniel had another vision this was not because of Nebuchadnezzar, but this vision actually happened 65 years later from the first vision that was given to Daniel. So in the book of Daniel chapter 7, we find that in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and vision of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven strove upon the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. What did you, when we discussed the statue, how many parts the statue was divided into? 4. Technically it's 4, right? So we have the head, the chest, the thighs, and the legs. And then, of course, it splits down at the 10 toes. When we read Daniel chapter 7, what do we find here in verse 3? And four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. Now, just a bit of a prequel, just to help us understand. When the Bible talks about the winds, the sea, and the beasts, it doesn't just talk about what's happening on the ocean, but winds represent strife or war. You can find that in Jeremiah chapter 25, 49, and 51. Seas, they represent nations or kingdoms. We find that in Revelation and Isaiah. And the beasts, they represent kingdoms. So it's a symbolic language that represents what Daniel has in his vision. So again, when we find in Daniel chapter 7, verse 3, it says that, and four great beasts came up from the sea. Based upon this slide, what do the beasts represent? They represent kingdoms. And you will see how this correlates to what we found already in Daniel chapter 2. So Daniel chapter 7, verse 4, it says, the first was like a lion. It had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings therefore were plucked, and it was lifted from the earth and made stand upon the feet as man, and man's heart was given to it. Now, the first beast is the lion. It represents the kingdom of Babylon. Hence, the lion, because when we looked at the vision in chapter 2, it started with the head of gold, and the head of gold was Babylon. Now, the lion, the animal of Ishtar, was favorite subject of all times in Babylon, that it was actually made out from mosaics on its gates. Nebuchadnezzar's power was felt from Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf and from the Asia Minor to Egypt. This was fittingly represented by the lion equipped with eagle's wings. They were ferocious and they were fast when they were attacking. But it goes on, it says, I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked. In later years, Babylon lost its power and glory that it possessed earlier. The plucking of the wings refers to the humiliation of the proud Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, during his period of madness in Daniel chapter 4. Do you remember what happened to him? Daniel came and said, look, I understand you built all of this, but you need to humble yourself. Otherwise, God will humble you. So, for a time, Nebuchadnezzar, kept in mind what Daniel told him. And one day, he came onto the porch and he said, is this not great Babylon that my hand has built? Right? And in that instance, he was taken away. And for 7 years, now, we don't know exactly what happened to him. Maybe he lost his mind or maybe something else happened. But for 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar was not himself. And after 7 years, he was restored. He repented. He acknowledged God. And I don't know, maybe Nebuchadnezzar will be in heaven. It's something that we cannot know. So, what's interesting also, so this is the plucking of the wings, right? So Babylon lost its swiftness. They were still strong, but they were not swift anymore. Now we come to the end of Babylon. Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, who, instead of driving away foes like a lion, he shut himself in the city. He was feasting and drinking with his lords until he was killed, and the kingdom was given to the Medes and Persians. Now also it's interesting that it denotes, and it was lifted up from the earth and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. A human heart is wicked, and by nature, and it does not listen to God. So when it references here that it was given a human heart, Belshazzar's wickedness was seen in drinking and lavishing parties, and specifically the kids studied today. Do you remember what came on the wall when he was feasting? A hand, that's right. And the hand condemned him by writing mene mene tekel for sin. That's another study. But by doing this, he sealed his fate. And that was the end of Babylon Empire. So again, the first was like a lion. The lion represented Babylon. The two wings represented swiftness. And then when he stood upon his feet and a man's heart was given to him, represents the fact that in later years, Babylon lost its ferocity and it became weak and it became very corrupt, and God ended that by allowing another kingdom to conquer that. So we continue on. We go to verse 5. Behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth of it between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. What was the kingdom that came after Babylon? Represented by the chest with 2 arms. Medo-Persia, correct. The Medes and Persians, they correspond to the silver image, what we studied. And a bear, in some respect, is inferior to the lion. So Medes and Persians were inferior to Babylon. They were nevertheless a cruel and rapacious nation in character. That's why represented by the bear. The bear itself, it says, that was raised on one side, as you can see in the photo as well. The kingdom was comprised of 2 nationalities, the Medes and the Persians. This was fulfilled by the Persian division of the kingdom, for although it came last, it attained higher eminence, becoming a dominant influence in the nation. Now, the 3 ribs in its mouth, where do ribs generally where are usually ribs situated in the body, or generally? In the chest area, right? It doesn't matter whether it's an animal or whether it's a human being. So, in this case, it represents defeated beasts, because in order for you to take a rib, that you must slay whatever you are in order to take that out. So it represents the kingdoms that were defeated by Medo-Persia. And we find this, that in 547, Medo-Persians, they defeated and conquered Lydia, Babylon in 539, and Egypt in 525. Those were the 3 ribs that were in bear's mouth. Now, what's interesting also about Medo-Persia is how they conquered Babylon. It says here that Babylon had stored provisions enough for very many years. So they cared nothing for the siege, and Cyrus knew not what to do. Whether then someone advised him in his difficulty, or he perceived himself what to do, I know not. But this is what he did. Drawing off the river by canal, he made the streams to sink till its former channels could be forded. When this happened, the Persians who opposed it with this intent made their way into Babylon by the channel of the Euphrates and brought them to a miserable end. God predicted that the kingdom will come to an end, because the statue was not fully made of gold, right? The statue was made of different metals, different qualities, different values. And this prediction or the prophecy that God made came to its fulfillment when Cyrus conquered Babylon and they became the great power. So this was the bear. Now we go to verse 6. And after this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So notice the characteristics of the leopard. It had 4 wings, swift in conquest. It had 4 heads, and dominion was given it. The lion had 2 wings. The leopard had 4 wings. It is much faster than the lion in its conquest. And when we looked at this last time, who was represented by the thighs, by the bronze thighs? Do you remember? Greece, correct. So Grecia was the power which succeeded Medo-Persia. Grecia must not be confused with classical Greece, inasmuch as that period preceded the fall of Persia. The Grecia of Daniel was the semi-Greek Macedonian Empire founded by Alexander the Great, which inaugurated what is called the Hellenistic period. Not until Alexander's days could reference be made to the first king of a Greek empire who was mighty king with great dominion. So Alexander the Great is the one that made all this possible. He was chosen by God and he was allowed by God to do what he did. So Alexander the Great, he was a master of the combination of various arms. He taught the world the advantages of campaigning in winter, the value of pressing through to the utmost, and the principle march divided, fight united. He marched usually in 2 divisions, one conducting the impediments, and in his own division traveling lights. His speed of movement was extraordinary. It is said that he attributed his military success to never putting anything off. The enormous distances traveled is unknown country imply a very high degree of organizing ability. In 10 years, he had only 2 serious breakdowns. Had a lesser man attempted what he achieved and failed, we should have heard enough of the hopeless military difficulties of the undertaking. Now, Alexander the Great, he made tremendous success in conquering what belonged to Babylon, then to Medo-Persia, so he conquered all of it, and he was able to expound even further. But it says that this beast, leopard, had 4 heads and 4 wings. So the wings clearly represent the swiftness. But what's with 4 heads if it was just one Alexander? What happened is that the Grecian Empire maintained its unity but little longer than the lifetime of Alexander. After his brilliant career ended in a fever induced by a drunken debauch, the empire was divided among his 4 leading generals. Cassander had Macedonia and Greece in the west. Lysimachus had the Thrace and part of Asia in Hellespont and Bosphorus in the north. Ptolemy received Egypt, Lydia, Arab, Palestine, and Coel Syria in the south, and Seleucus had Syria and all the rest of Alexander's dominion in the east. By the year 301 BC, with the death of Antiochus, the division of the kingdom of Alexander into 4 parts was completed by his general. So we can see that the Bible depicts this leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, and we can see how the history proves what happened, why there were 4 heads. One beast with 4 heads. But what's interesting also, when we look at the verse, it says that, and dominion was given to it. It's a fun fact, and I'll share this with you. The language of Greek became a common language of the ancient world in preparation for the promulgation of the gospel. The New Testament was written in Greek. The next empire, Rome, provided the roads and a period of relative peace for the initial spread of the gospel. So you can see here that the verse that we looked at in the last study, that God sets the kings and he sets up the kingdoms and he allows them to rule for a certain time, but at the same time God uses them to promote the gospel. And in a specific instance, the Greek language, we refer to the original Hebrew and the original Greek when we study the New Testament specifically. And we can see that the Rome provided relative peace, and the Romans built the roads, and that allowed the gospel to go even further than it was initially. So that was the leopard. Now we come to the last beast. Daniel chapter 7, verse 7, it says, "And after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns." Inspiration finds that no beast in nature to symbolize the power here illustrated. There were no hoofs, no horns, no wings, no scales, teeth or nails, or any beast found in nature that would correspond to this. The power is diverse from all others as well, and the symbol is completely different found in any other animal. And do you remember what was the fourth kingdom that was represented by iron legs? Rome, correct. So by around 200 BC, Rome had become the dominant controlling power in the western Mediterranean region. In 197, defeated Macedonia and set up the Greek state under her own protection. In 190 BC, Rome defeated Antiochus III and took the Seleucid territory as far as the Tarsus mountains. In 168, she ended the monarchy in Macedonia and divided into 4 confederates, and the same year warned Antiochus IV away from his attack on Egypt. So in 146, Rome annexed Macedonia as a province and placed the most of the Greek states under the governors of Macedonia. So this is Rome. It's a terrible power, terrible beast, ferocious, destroying anything that is found on its path. And we do find history telling us that when Romans came to rule, there was no mercy. They would go, conquer, destroy, enslave. By doing this, they were able to go further and further. So the beast is terrible and dreadful, strong exceedingly, and great iron of teeth. The fourth beast parallels to the legs of the iron kingdom. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped residue with the feet of it. The Romans made slaves of many of those they conquered. It was diverse from all other beasts that were before us. Rome was different because it was the first republic. In fact, it had 7 forms of government in total. So, this was legs. And then when we look at the statue, what followed the legs? The ankles and what? 10 toes, right. And when we look at this beast, what do we find here? The last part. It had what? 10 horns. All right, so the similarity is there. So the 10 horns are the 10 kingdoms. The successive invasion of the Roman Empire by many Germanic tribes and subsequent replacement of the empire by a number of separate kingdoms, because a score or more barbarian tribes invaded the empire, was divided into 10 kingdoms. We have the Alemanni, the Franks, Burgundians, Suevi, Vandals, Visigoths, Saxons, Ostrogoths, Lombards, and Heruli. The period of the empire's division was one of the great upheaval, confusion, and change. So by 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire had been divided into 10 kingdoms. And these 10 kingdoms, again, they correspond to the 10 toes that we studied last time. But it goes on. It says, "I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So the horns, there were 10 horns, and 3 were plucked, and the little horn came up from among one of them. Now, to give you a bit of history of why were the 10 horns plucked up. So when the Catholicism or Roman Catholic Church began its existence, they were united on the fact that there's a Trinity. That's what they call the Father, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, and they're all equal level. But Arius was a parish priest of an ancient and influential church of Alexandria, promulgated his doctrine to the world, occasioning so fierce a controversy in the Christian church. The General Council was called a Nicaea by the Emperor Constantine in 325 to consider and rule upon the teachings. So Arius maintained that the Son was totally and essentially distinct from the Father, that he was the first and noblest of those beings whom the Father had created out of nothing, the instrument by whose subordinate operation the Almighty Father formed the universe, and therefore inferior to the Father both in nature and dignity. So there was Arian teaching. This opinion was condemned by the council, which decreed that Christ was one of the same substance with the Father. Arius was banished into Illyria, and followers were compelled to give their assent to the creed composed on that occasion. So, for ages it continued to agitate the Christian world, the Arians everywhere becoming the bitter enemies of the Pope and of the Roman Catholic Church. It was evident that the spread of Arianism would check the onward march of Catholicism, and that the possession of Italy and its renowned capital by the people of Arian persuasions would be fatal to the supremacy of Catholic bishop. The prophecy, however, had declared that this horn symbolizing the papacy would rise to supreme power, and that in reaching this position it would subdue the 3 kings. So how did that happen? Well, they destroyed those kingdoms. The 3 horns were plucked up. It was the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. I might cite that these were eradicated from before the Pope out of the list first given: Heruli under the Odoacer, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. From the historical testimony above cited, we think that it clearly established that the 3 horns plucked up were the powers were the Heruli in 493, the Vandals 534, and the Ostrogoths finally in 553, through the effective oppositions by the latter to the decree of Justinian, ceased when they were driven from Rome by Belarius in 583. So these 3 powers were eradicated, paving the way for the rise of papacy to supreme power. Under the Roman Empire, the popes had no temporal powers. But when the Roman Empire had disintegrated and in its place taken by a number of rude, barbarous kingdoms, the Roman Catholic Church not only became independent of the states in religious affairs, but dominated secular affairs as well. At times under such rulers as Charles Maginn, Otto the Great, and Henry III, the civil power controlled by the church to some extent, but in general under the weak political system of feudalism. The well-organized, unified, and centralized church, with the Pope at its head, was not only independent in ecclesiastical affairs, but also controlled civil affairs. So this is where Rome became, this is where the civil Rome was destroyed, and the papal Rome became a power that could not be contended with. And we will see this in our next study, what that led to. So Rome destroyed the 3 kingdoms that were opposing it, and that paved the way for them to spread out and become not only church authority, but also civil authority. And this is where we come into the dark ages, and we will see how all of that plays into the prophecy. But the point here is, we looked at this verse last time, Daniel chapter 2 verses 21 and 22 tells us that, and he changes the times and seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and the secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth within him. Through all of this, there were always faithful and chosen people that served God and only God. We find Daniel, who lived through Babylon, who lived through Medo-Persia. He was faithful to God. God protected him, and God kept him in the position where he was. We find that, just a brief example of Greece, right? How Greek language became so important that the New Testament was written in it, and through Rome, which was the next empire, the gospel was able to be spread out in many, many countries. So through all of this, we need to remember that God is always the driving factor of why this king is there and why this king is not there. He allows certain things to happen, but still under his control. So my wish and prayer today is that we remember that we serve a God that has a plan. That plan's been written in the Bible. We need to look for it, we need to find it, and we need to follow it so that God can bless us in our study as well as our personal life, as well as our spiritual life. Amen. Let us conclude with hymn number 660.